When one considers how many thousands of wonderful composers there are, both living and dead, it is hard for me to pick the ones that I believe will have the most impact on you girls. In my research about various composers this term, I came across one who I did not know about myself, and it shocked me because the music itself is so spectacular that I couldn't believe it had taken me so long to learn about it. But more than that, I believe this composer to be one of the most inspiring people I've ever learnt about. Her name is Dame Ethel Mary Smyth. Throughout her life, she demonstrated unbelievable determination, strength of character, and fearlessness. She was not afraid to stand up to people and spoke out when she saw injustice, even if it meant her life would be negatively affected by it. I want you to know that we're not just going to be learning about the amazing music Dame Ethel Smyth wrote. You are also going to be learning about the incredible woman who wrote it, and that is the subject of today's lesson. I hope that by the end of this video, you will be as inspired as I am to be more like Dame Ethel Smyth, to stand up for what you believe in, and to follow your dreams, no matter who tells you that you can't achieve them. I hope that you will be inspired to have the courage to be truly yourself and to work hard at the talents you have been given so that you can realize your true potential. And I hope that you will also hear her music and feel as I do, that it is as good as any man's compositions, and that we need to support women in the arts as much as we can. Smyth was born in 1858 in Bourne House, Bexley, which is in Kent, and about half an hour's drive from school. She had 7 siblings. Can you imagine that? 7! And a very strict father, who was a Major General in the Royal Artillery, and very much against her making a career in music. Growing up in Kent, young Ethel had no interest in doing only things that were socially acceptable for girls to do. Back then, girls were considered to be dainty and weak, and had to be quiet and calm at all times. They were to do only things like sew, read books, take gentle strolls, marry someone at a young age, and have children. Most importantly, in those days, the wife had to be subservient to her husband, which means to allow him to make all decisions and give in to him at all times. As a young child, instead of calmly doing as was then expected of young ladies, Dame Ethel hunted, hiked, and mountain climbed. According to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, she also enjoyed unladylike activities such as tennis, golf, and cycling. Later on in her life, Dame Ethel was the first woman to be seen riding a bicycle in Frimhurst, where she lived, usually smoking and always accompanied by a sheepdog. Legend has it that she was once even seen writing a letter whilst riding a bike. I don't know how true that is, girls, but what I do know is that whilst riding a bike is normal now for girls like you, a lot of people disapproved of girls cycling and doing other physical activities back then. Here is a quote taken from a newspaper called the Sunday Herald in 1891, when Dame Ethel was 43. "I think the most vicious thing I ever saw in all my life is a woman on a bicycle," I had thought that cigarette smoking was the worst thing a woman could do, but I changed my mind. Smyth was an outstanding pianist as a young girl, but sadly, an accident with a knife damaged her hand badly when she was 12. Although she was still able to play, she couldn't be a professional pianist when she grew up anymore. So at such a young age, Ethel Smyth set her mind to becoming a composer. Her father was very much against her becoming a composer, as it was very unusual for girls to take up a career in such a focused and determined way. Do you know what you would like to be when you grow up, girls? It is hard for us to imagine this now, as I am sure all your parents would support you and be proud of whatever career you choose to follow. So Smyth and her strict father battled for a number of her teenage years until the young Ethel refused to leave her room or obey any instructions until her father eventually gave in and allowed her to go to Leipzig in Germany to study composition at the Conservatoire. A conservatoire is a college where people go to study the arts, particularly music. Once Smyth got to the Conservatoire in Leipzig in 1877 at age 19, she was disappointed with the standard of teaching and dropped out after 1 year, going on to study privately with a composition teacher in Leipzig. Whilst there, she met and became friendly with many famous composers like Brahms, Clara Schumann, Dvorak, Grieg, and Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky famously had this to say about Ethel Smyth. Miss Smyth is one of the few women composers whom one can seriously consider to be achieving something valuable in the field of musical creation. I'm not sure if Miss Smyth would have taken this compliment without challenging her friend Tchaikovsky. I'm pretty sure that she would have wanted to say this to her friend, and maybe she even did. Thank you very much, Tchaikovsky, but have you considered that no women are being given any opportunities to excel as composers these days? They aren't being promoted as equal to male composers, and even those that are being dismissed by the critics, the music industry, and audiences, simply because we are women. Smyth stayed in Leipzig all the way through her 20s and into her 30s, and then moved back to England, where she composed a masterpiece called Mass in D. This is the Gloria from the Mass. The playwright, Bernard Shaw, was fascinated by the piece, later calling it a cure for sexism, saying, "It was your music that cured me forever of the old delusion that woman could not do man's work in art and all other things." With that, Smyth's friends begged her to take the next step. She needed to write an opera. Remember that an opera is a long piece of music where the whole story is told through solo and chorus singing that is accompanied by an orchestra. When she finished her second opera, The Forest, which she wrote when she was 43, she was hell-bent on getting it produced, if not for her sake, then for the woman who followed her. In a letter which she wrote a year later, she said, "I feel I must fight for my music, because I want women to turn their heads to big and difficult jobs, not just to go on hugging the shore, afraid to put out to sea. Here's an interesting and humorous story about what she did when one of her operas was being staged for the first time and things were not going her way.
However, Smyth could be very precise, and this came back to bite her on more than one occasion. Most famously, she was going to have an opera premiered, but she objected to several unauthorized cuts taken by the conductor. And when these cuts were not reinstated at her insistence, she snuck into the opera house in the middle of the night, took all of the scores and parts, and skipped town. And she was known for sneaking in amongst the orchestral musicians and slipping in revised versions of parts to performers, completely unbeknownst to the conductors, who would then become extremely confused when they would try to conduct something that they saw on their page and something completely different came out of the performers.
She went on to write 6 operas and performed them at leading houses including the Royal Opera House in London and the Metropolitan Opera House, known as the Met, in New York. In fact, she was the first woman to have an opera put on at the Met. The next time a woman's opera was to be put on at the Met was in 2016, only 4 years ago. And that was 113 years after Dame Ethel's first opera was put on. Why do you think the Met took so long to put on another woman's opera, when there are currently over 500 operas written by women? Can you see now why women in the arts need our full support, girls? Before 1918, women were not allowed to vote in general elections like the ones we have had recently. Many women felt this was unfair, so they came together to form a movement called the Women's Suffrage Movement. Ethel Smyth was a key member of this movement from 1910, and during this time she paused her music career to give her full attention to this important movement. This must have been a great sacrifice for her, considering how passionate she was about composing. She did, however, write a song for the suffragettes, which you will hear later. In 1912, after over 30 years of campaigning for the vote, the women's suffrage movement was largely being ignored. In response to this, the women, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, decided to smash all the windows in the main London roads to get people's attention. For this, almost 200 women were arrested in London. Ethel Smyth was involved in this, and you can listen to her explaining why this happened.
But in London, more and more excitement was being caused by a group of women who had very different ideas from the Buxton ladies, the suffragettes. It is now my pleasure to introduce one of them to you, Dame Ethel Smyth, the composer.
At exactly 5:30 one memorable evening in 1912, relays of women produced hammers from their muffs and handbags and proceeded methodically to smash up windows in all the big London thoroughfares, Piccadilly, Regent Street, and so on, inspired by the knowledge that exactly at that moment Mrs. Pankhurst was opening the ball with a stone aimed at a window of 10 Downing Street. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Pankhurst was not a cricketer, and in spite of much practice in my garden, her stone fell harmlessly in the area of number 10. But her companion's stone did its duty nobly. Nearly 200 women were arrested that evening. Some of us had been told off to attack private houses, and I had begged from Mr. Lulu Harcourt, because of an infuriating remark of his, he was Colonial Secretary, to the effect that if all women were as pretty and as wise as his own wife, we should have the vote tomorrow. I walked into Berkeley Square, where he lived, and before his house, he being of the government, stood a policeman. Oh, Constable, can you tell me the number of Lady Dorchester's house?
It's somewhere the other side of the street, ma'am, but I can't rightly think of the number. No, let me
Well, perhaps you could tell me who lives at this house.
I was expecting that now. Now, will you come along with me quietly?
Certainly. Where are we going, Constable?
Vine Street, just round the corner.
I say, did my stone hit the window?
Yes, it did.
Thank goodness. But it made such an odd, muffled sound.
For her actions during this protest, she was sentenced to 2 months in jail, but she only served 5 weeks. When Smyth's friend, the musician Thomas Beecham, visited her at Holloway Prison, he stumbled upon a remarkable scene. Dozens of suffragettes had rallied together in the prison yard. Above the courtyard, Smyth stood in her jail cell and proudly listened to the women below. They were singing "The March of the Women," a piece she had composed 2 years earlier as the anthem for the Women's Social and Political Union. Smyth grabbed a toothbrush, reached her arms beyond the bars of the prison window, and conducted the chorus below. After her early release from jail due to ill health, a journalist wrote this after interviewing her at her quiet house in Surrey. As one talks to her, it becomes evident that hers is a personality of no common strength. She radiates an intense nerve force, which makes her capable of great things in any cause with which she sympathizes keenly. In 1918, women were given the right to vote, and in 1922, Ethel Smyth was made a dame for her extraordinary contribution to music and the arts. She was the first woman composer to be given this honor. On her 75th birthday, Dame Ethel's work was celebrated at the Royal Albert Hall in the presence of Queen Mary. Devastatingly, however, Dame Ethel was completely deaf by then and could hear neither the music nor the audience's great appreciation of it. But she is said to have enjoyed the event tremendously. She died of natural causes at the ripe old age of 86 at her home in Woking in 1944. In a time when women were not at all encouraged to do anything apart from get married and have children, Dame Ethel Smyth's strength of character and determination from a young age meant that she refused to marry and instead focused her passion and vast range of skills on many areas that she felt demanded her attention. She was a towering and commanding figure in British musical and intellectual life in the early 20th century, a well-known advocate for women's rights in suffrage from 1910 and even went to prison for it. And she was an author of 10 books. Despite the difficulties she experienced as a woman composer, this seemed to motivate her instead of discourage her. She truly is a woman to be admired and inspired by.